The Islamic Republic of Iran is facing an unprecedented crisis as widespread protests have erupted across the nation, met with a level of violence that surpasses anything witnessed in the country's recent history. What began as demonstrations has transformed into what many are calling a massacre, with conservative estimates suggesting thousands have been killed in just the past few days. A communication blackout. The Iranian government has implemented a near-total internet shutdown, cutting off the country's 92 million citizens from the outside world. This digital blackout serves a dual purpose, preventing protesters from organizing and ensuring that evidence of the regime's brutal response remains hidden from international scrutiny. The only lifeline for many Iranians has been approximately 40,000 to 50,000 Starlink satellite internet terminals smuggled into the country, but even these are now under systematic attack by security forces. Messages that have managed to escape the country paint a horrifying picture. One testimony from a witness describes scenes of indiscriminate violence. They mowed down everyone on Friday with gunfire. They opened fire on everyone. The message continues with desperate urgency, documenting how Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps forces killed at least 20 people on the first day in just one location, with the witness personally transporting 5 bodies to a nearby clinic. The sporadic internet connection that allowed this message to be sent lasted mere seconds before cutting out again. State media's chilling warning. Perhaps most disturbing is the content being broadcast on Iranian state television, which remains the only source of information for most citizens trapped inside the communications blackout. The government has issued warnings to parents that amount to a threat. Do not allow your children to participate in protests, and if they are killed, do not complain to authorities. State broadcasters have called upon religious groups and loyalist organizations to mobilize, warning families to keep track of their children. The broadcast explicitly states that if a bullet goes astray or is fired, and if something happens to someone, do not complain later. This represents not just an acknowledgement of the lethal force being employed, but a preemptive absolution of responsibility for the deaths of civilians. The scale of violence. According to multiple sources and eyewitness accounts, the death toll has reached staggering levels. Conservative estimates place the number of killed at approximately 2,000 people within just 44 hours following the internet shutdown. However, some reports suggest the actual number could be as high as 4,000. To put this in perspective, during the November 2019 economic protests, which became known as Bloody November, the Iranian regime killed around 1,500 people over a much longer period. This was previously considered the deadliest crackdown in the Islamic Republic's history. The current violence has surpassed that terrible benchmark in less than 2 days. Medical professionals inside Iran have provided testimony that underscores the scale of this catastrophe. One doctor in a northern city reported that a single hospital received at least 70 bodies. Hospital workers, speaking to international media, describe morgues overflowing with casualties, forcing staff to stack bodies on top of one another. When the morgue reached capacity, bodies were moved to prayer rooms within the hospital facilities. Systematic hunting of dissidents. The Iranian security apparatus has deployed sophisticated methods to identify and punish protesters. Revolutionary Guard forces are utilizing drones during nighttime protests, flying overhead to record the faces of demonstrators. These surveillance operations continue throughout the night, and by morning, security forces conduct raids on the homes of identified protesters. According to reports, at least 2,300 people have been arrested so far. These arrests carry severe consequences. The supreme leader has designated protesters as enemies of God, a classification that in Iran's legal system can result in immediate execution. Essentially, arrest equals a death sentence for many of those detained during the protests. Beyond aerial surveillance, the regime has positioned snipers on rooftops across major cities. These marksmen have opened fire on crowds, with reports indicating that hundreds died this way in Tehran alone during a single night. The use of snipers represents a calculated decision to employ lethal force against unarmed civilians, transforming city streets into killing zones. The Starlink crackdown. The Iranian government has now officially classified unauthorized satellite internet as a threat to state security. Possession of Starlink terminals is no longer treated as a technical violation, but as a security offense punishable by severe consequences. During internet blackouts, any active connection becomes immediately visible to authorities. When all fiber optic and mobile networks go dark, a Starlink Wi-Fi signal functions as what security experts describe as a homing beacon. Security forces have mobilized a comprehensive effort to eliminate these communication channels. Checkpoints have been established throughout major cities, specifically to search for satellite equipment. Informants have been activated to report neighbors suspected of possessing terminals. Locations where Starlink connections are detected are raided and treated as what the government calls hostile cells. The strategy appears to be working from the regime's perspective. Reports indicate significantly fewer videos are emerging from Iran compared to the initial days of protests, suggesting the government has achieved substantial success in controlling information flow and shutting down alternative communication methods. Protests continue despite repression. Despite the violent crackdown and communication difficulties, protests have not ceased. Footage that has managed to escape the country shows massive crowds in multiple cities, including Tehran and other major urban centers. In one striking display of defiance, protesters used their mobile phone lights to illuminate streets after authorities cut electrical power to residential areas in an attempt to discourage demonstrations. The images show thousands of lights flickering in the darkness as protesters continue chanting anti-government slogans. The movement has begun to expand beyond its initial base. Iranian Azerbaijani Turkish political groups, representing one of the largest ethnic communities in Iran, have issued a joint statement calling on the country's Turkish population to fully participate in the ongoing protests. This ethnic and regional mobilization represents a significant escalation, potentially broadening the movement beyond urban centers and into regions with distinct ethnic identities. Armed resistance emerges. Adding another dimension to the crisis, the Kurdish Freedom Party, PAK, has claimed responsibility for attacks on Revolutionary Guard bases, reporting that they have wounded at least 3 members of the security forces. This organization consists of experienced fighters who previously battled ISIS in Syria and have worked alongside United States forces. While their numbers may be limited, they represent a trained and competent fighting force that could complicate the regime's efforts to maintain control. The emergence of armed resistance, even on a small scale, signals a dangerous escalation. What began as civilian protests could potentially evolve into more organized opposition if various ethnic and regional groups coordinate their efforts against the central government. International response and military options. The international community, particularly the United States, has begun responding to the crisis. President Trump issued a statement declaring that Iran is looking at freedom perhaps like never before. The US stands ready to help. While such statements have become relatively common, recent reporting suggests more concrete discussions are underway. The Wall Street Journal has reported that the Trump administration has initiated preliminary discussions regarding potential military action against Iran. These discussions include identifying specific targets and considering various operational approaches. One option under consideration involves large-scale aerial strikes targeting Iran's military infrastructure. The New York Times has corroborated this reporting, noting that President Trump has been briefed on multiple military options, including strikes on both military and certain non-military sites in Tehran. Some of the proposed options specifically target elements of Iran's security services responsible for the violent crackdown. However, military commanders have indicated they would require additional time before executing any such operations, suggesting that immediate action is not imminent. The Iranian government appears to be taking these reports seriously. The country's foreign minister, who was attending an economic summit in Lebanon, abruptly cut short his trip and returned to Tehran. While this could be related to multiple factors, given the domestic crisis, the timing suggests concern about potential international intervention. Regional military movements. In a development that may serve as a message to Iran, the United States conducted airstrikes in Syria against Islamic State targets. These strikes, described as retaliation for the killing of 2 Iowa National Guard soldiers and their interpreter, involved F-15E Strike Eagles, A-10 Warthogs, and Army Apache helicopter gunships. The timing and proximity to Iran's borders have not gone unnoticed by regional observers. Evolving government narrative. The Iranian government's messaging about the protests has shifted significantly. Initially, the supreme leader referred to demonstrators as rioters, a term that, while dismissive, still acknowledged them as civilians. However, state television has now begun describing protesters as armed terrorists. This rhetorical escalation represents a deliberate attempt to dehumanize protesters in the eyes of the Iranian public and justify continued use of lethal force. This narrative shift follows a familiar authoritarian playbook. First dismiss opposition as criminal elements, then escalate the language to portray them as existential threats to national security. By labeling protesters as terrorists, the regime creates a framework where any level of violence can be justified as defensive action against armed insurgents. A nation at a crossroads. The current crisis represents a critical moment for Iran. The regime's response indicates genuine fear that this protest movement differs fundamentally from previous uprisings. The unprecedented level of violence being employed suggests that authorities believe the government's survival is at stake. Several factors distinguish this movement from earlier protests. Demonstrators are increasingly using their real names and showing their faces on social media despite the risks. This openness reflects a level of fearlessness that previous movements lacked. The willingness of protesters to continue despite massive casualties suggests deep-seated grievances that cannot be easily suppressed. The involvement of ethnic minorities and the emergence of armed resistance groups add complexity to what began as primarily urban protests against economic conditions or specific policies. If the movement successfully maintains momentum and continues to broaden its base, the Islamic Republic may face the most serious challenge to its authority since the 1979 revolution. The Information War. One of the most critical aspects of the current crisis is the battle over information. The Iranian government understands that international awareness and documentation of atrocities can create pressure for intervention and reduce the regime's options for responding with impunity. By cutting internet access and systematically eliminating alternative communication channels, authorities are attempting to operate in darkness. However, the digital age has made complete information control increasingly difficult. Even with systematic efforts to eliminate Starlink terminals and punish anyone found with satellite internet equipment, some information continues to leak out. Each video, photograph, or testimony that reaches the international community serves as evidence of the regime's actions and keeps global attention focused on events inside Iran. The challenge for the international community is acting on limited and difficult-to-verify information. Every report from inside the country must be approached with appropriate caution, given the impossibility of independent verification. Yet the consistency of accounts from multiple sources, combined with the regime's extreme measures to prevent information from escaping, creates a compelling case that something extraordinary and terrible is happening inside Iran. Looking ahead, the situation in Iran remains fluid and dangerous. The regime has demonstrated a willingness to employ maximum force to maintain control, while protesters have shown remarkable resilience in continuing their demonstrations despite massive casualties. This creates an unstable dynamic where escalation on both sides appears likely. The international community faces difficult decisions about how to respond. Military intervention carries significant risks and could produce unintended consequences. Yet inaction in the face of mass killings raises profound moral questions. Economic sanctions, while important, have historically proven insufficient to change regime behavior when authorities believe their survival is at stake. For the people of Iran, the coming days and weeks will determine whether this moment of unprecedented protest can translate into meaningful change, or whether the regime's brutal crackdown will succeed in crushing the movement as it has suppressed previous uprisings. What is clear is that the Iranian government is fighting with everything at its disposal to maintain power, and the human cost of this struggle continues to mount with each passing day. The world watches, waits, and hopes that the violence will end and that the aspirations of millions of Iranians for freedom and dignity will somehow prevail against a regime willing to kill its own citizens by the thousands to maintain control. The outcome of this crisis will shape Iran's future and send powerful signals about what is possible when citizens rise up against authoritarian rule in the 21st century.